Kevin Johnson stepped onto the jet bridge just as the morning sun stretched its first golden fingers across the tarmac at Sacramento International Airport. He carried a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder and gripped his boarding pass in the other hand. At 6 feet 1 inch tall, he moved with the easy confidence of a teenager who knew his worth, even when the world might not see it. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel mixed with the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby concession stand. He paused for a moment to adjust the strap of his bag, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of his grandmother's advice. Carry yourself like you belong, and someday the world will believe you do. He smiled at a flight attendant bustling past, but she did not smile back. That was when the small knot of unease began to form in the pit of his stomach. He had spent the past week helping his grandmother in Reading, Pennsylvania. She had just had knee surgery and could barely stand long enough to water her flower pots, let alone chase stray leaves from the garden. Kevin stocked her refrigerator with her favorite vanilla almond milk. He trimmed the roses in the backyard, and he taught her how to use her new remote control for the television. She laughed when the volume suddenly cranked to full blast on the news channel, and he showed her how to hit the mute button without calling her grandchildren in New York. Those simple moments of caring felt like a gift he was proud to give. He thought about her gentle brown eyes and the way her smile crinkled the corners of her cheeks, and he carried that warmth with him onto the plane. The gate for Flight 4312 to Phoenix was already buzzing with activity when Kevin reached it. He scanned the digital display overhead. Boarding 14A-14F. His seat, 14A, was highlighted green on the little screen. He checked his phone again just to be sure. His itinerary read, Sacramento to Phoenix, layover, then on to Atlanta, home. The entire trip was supposed to be easy, a chance to zone out to his favorite playlist for a couple of hours, maybe read a few pages of the novel he'd started last week. But as he approached the end of the jet bridge, the energy in the cabin felt off. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a quiet way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. That's when he saw her. Flight Attendant Teresa Delacroix had a posture so rigid it looked rehearsed. She stood at about 5 feet 4 inches tall, her platinum blonde hair pulled back until not a single strand escaped. The silver wings pinned to her crisp uniform shirt caught the overhead light and flashed back at him like a warning sign. Her lips were a thin line, and her blue eyes scanned each passenger as if she was sorting out weeds from daisies. In that moment, Kevin felt the cabin temperature drop a few degrees. Even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the air seemed colder around her. He swallowed, straightened his shoulders, and walked forward. "Excuse me, ma'am. I think there's someone in my seat," he said politely, holding out his phone to show the seat assignment. He kept his tone calm and steady, mindful of his grandmother's warning never to give anyone an excuse to label him. He sounded more like a grandson asking for a cup of sugar than a teenager asserting his rights. Delacroix frowned without even looking at the screen. "That's not your seat," she said sharply. "You're supposed to sit in the back." Her voice carried through the aisle like a whip crack. Kevin's chest tightened. He blinked in surprise and glanced around. A man in a suit at the next row raised an eyebrow. A young woman clutching her designer handbag peeked over the armrest and then turned away. The other passengers remained silent. No one intervened. "No," Kevin replied softly but firmly. "My boarding pass says 14A. The app shows it." He held the phone higher. The display glowed in his palm. Flight 4312, Seat 14A, Gate A5, Sacramento to Phoenix. Delacroix's lips curled into a sneer. "I don't care what your app says," she said. She leaned in so close that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something floral with a spicy undertone that reminded him of potpourri left in a church sanctuary. "Don't talk back to me. You go sit where you're told, or I'll have you removed." Her tone was theatrical, as though she were auditioning for a role in a courtroom drama. The aisle seemed to close in around him. Kevin took a breath and felt his heart pounding. He could hear a faint tap of his own pulse in his ears. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some pretended to read magazines, some stared down at their own phones. A child in the third row pressed his forehead against the window, peering out at nothing interesting. No one said a word. Kevin felt his face heat up with a rush of shame, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was being treated as though he did. He could feel his palms start to sweat. "Please," he said, keeping his voice low and controlled. "Please scan my ticket." He glanced at the flight attendant's badge, which simply read, T. Delacroix. The moment hung between them, heavy and electric. She rolled her eyes. "I don't have time for this," she snapped, then louder into her walkie-talkie. "Someone at 14A is refusing to comply. I need the captain to remove this passenger." Her words reverberated through the cabin. A low murmur rose like a tide. A few phones jumped from pockets. Someone across the aisle whispered, "He isn't even seated yet." Another passenger, an older woman with silver hair, leaned forward and whispered to her husband, her voice trembling, "He seems polite." As Kevin stood there with his phone in one hand and his boarding pass in the other, something inside him shifted. He felt a quiet steel settle in his chest. He was tired of shrinking. He was tired of being treated like he did not belong. His grandmother's steady eyes filled his mind. It was time to live up to her words. Without another word to Teresa Delacroix, he pulled his phone back to his ear and dialed. He pressed it against his shoulder, out of her sight, but within his grasp. A few passengers twisted in their seats to watch him, curiosity finally breaking the silence. "Uncle X," he whispered when the call connected. "I need you." The man on the other end answered with calm authority. "Kevin, tell me what's happening." Xavier Johnson, his uncle, was a civil rights attorney in Oakland, California. He had built a reputation for standing up to injustice the way storms stand up to docks. Kevin said a few quick sentences. The seat mix-up, Delacroix's threats, her refusal to scan the pass, the humiliation. He spoke softly but clearly, so nothing could be misinterpreted. "Stay calm," Xavier instructed. "Keep your phone on you, record everything." Kevin nodded, though no one could see it. He held the phone closer to his mouth and looked up at Delacroix. Her lips were pursed, her eyes flicked to his phone, then back to the front of the cabin. He spoke again, deliberately, to document the moment. "I am speaking with my attorney," he said, loud enough for her to hear, but not so loud as to lose his composure. It was as if the words snapped her attention back to him. Her jaw tightened, but before she could reply, her walkie-talkie crackled. Captain Andrews's voice came through, calm but firm. "Teed. Delacroix, is there a problem in the cabin?" "Passenger at 14A is non-compliant," she reported. "Refusing instructions. He needs to be removed." A tense hush fell. Kevin stood still, confident in his stance, phone pressed to his ear. Around him, passengers leaned in, some shifting closer to the aisle. A few started filming. He sensed their support. At that moment, another flight attendant appeared, moving down the aisle with measured steps. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and a kind face. His name tag read G. Norrell. He paused beside Kevin and knelt, lowering his voice so that only he and Kevin could hear. "Son, may I see your boarding pass?" he asked gently. Kevin handed it over. Norrell scanned the barcode with a small handheld device that beeped once. He frowned thoughtfully at the screen, then looked up. "You are in the right seat," he said quietly. There was a last-minute reassignment at the gate. He tapped a few keys and showed Kevin the screen. The manifest updated. 14A, Kevin Johnson. Teresa Delacroix reached his shoulder and peered over, her face contorted with disbelief. "That can't be right," she insisted. "The manifest shows someone else." Norrell shook his head slowly. "Not anymore. It's updated. He's here." He glanced around the cabin. He saw phones pointed in their direction. He saw passengers nodding. A few faces showed regret for what Kevin had endured. Delacroix's cheeks flushed. She spun toward the galley and stomped away, as if determined to erase her own mistake. Kevin allowed himself the smallest flicker of relief, but he did not celebrate. He moved down the aisle and slid into 14A, the window seat exactly where he belonged. He set his duffel bag at his feet and sat, his back straight, phone still held loosely in his hand. He texted his uncle. "They see it now?" He stared out the window as the cabin lights dimmed slightly in anticipation of doors closing. When Delacroix returned to her duties, her movements were stiff and barely concealed anger. Kevin watched her from behind his curtain of dark, curly hair, seeing her shoulders tense as she leaned over to greet a passenger in the next row. He let out a slow breath, feeling his heart rate begin to slow. All around him, passengers whispered to each other, some casting sympathetic glances his way. A man in a faded baseball cap muttered softly, "That woman came in hot for no reason." Kevin smiled at him, a small gesture of thanks. Back in Oakland, Xavier Johnson had not wasted time. His voice crackled through the speaker of Kevin's phone. "I'm on hold with Blue Air Legal. Keep recording. Do not say anything more to her. I will call you back." Kevin nodded, though still no one could see him do it. Instead, he leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes for a moment. He felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. He had stood up for himself without losing his composure. He had shown disrespect back where there had been disrespect. And though the flight was still on hold, he knew the real journey was only beginning. As the cabin filled with the murmur of boarding finalization, Kevin's mind drifted back to his grandmother's garden. He pictured her planting daisies in neat rows, patting the earth with her worn hands. He pictured her whispering encouragement to her grandson who wanted only to belong. He felt her presence in every pulse of courage that transported him from shame to standing tall. He opened his eyes again and looked around. The window was dark except for the runway lights reflecting off the glass. He could see the first officer standing in the aisle, checking the overhead bins. He could see passengers fastening seatbelts. He could see hope in their eyes, hope that a young black boy had refused to be moved aside. And Kevin Johnson understood that he had done more than claim a seat. He had claimed his dignity, his humanity. He had reminded a cabin full of strangers that every person, regardless of skin color or age, deserves respect. The engines were beginning to rev. The flight would depart soon. But for Kevin, the flight had already taken him somewhere far more important. Kevin Johnson felt the weight of every eye in the cabin the moment a young woman in a sunshine yellow hoodie rose from her seat a few rows ahead and spoke up. Her voice carried, clear and firm. "If anyone saw what just happened, keep your recordings. Don't delete them. The truth matters." It was a simple act of solidarity, but in that silent plane cabin, it felt like an electric jolt. Phones lifted, shoulders straightened. Even Teresa Delacroix, the embattled flight attendant forced to stand before her peers, caught the tail of the ripple she had created. Her face went pale under the cabin lights. From the moment the young woman spoke, the tide turned. Kevin stood in the aisle clutching his phone and boarding pass, his chest tight with relief and lingering anxiety. Delacroix had operated as if she were above reproach, barking orders, threatening federal charges, all because she refused to see a 16-year-old boy as anything but a problem to be moved. But now, the cabin had seen too much. Whispers swelled into affirmations. A hush fell over the rows as Captain Andrews's calm voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been advised of an issue requiring our attention before departure. We will return to the gate shortly. Please, remain seated." The announcement was clinical but unmistakable. The engines backed off. The plane slowed its taxi to a stop. Kevin let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He leaned against the seat back and closed his eyes for a moment, tasting freedom in the charged air. Passengers turned in their seats to watch the drama unfold as if they were at the edge of an arena. Out in the aisle, a young flight attendant whose bronze skin shone with worry knelt beside him. She lowered her voice so only he could hear. "I saw what happened," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. That should never have happened to you." Kevin looked at her, blinking back emotion, and managed a small nod. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. "You handled it better than most grown-ups would have." Behind him, voices rose again as the cabin door opened and 2 airport security officers stepped on board, flanking a stern-faced Blue Air supervisor in a navy blazer. The supervisor's badge read L. Monroe. She moved with efficiency, her eyes scanning the rows until they rested on Teresa Delacroix. "Ms. Delacroix," Monroe said, her tone clipped but controlled. "Please, come with us to the front of the cabin." Delacroix's shoulders stiffened. For a brief second, she flicked her eyes toward Kevin, but she turned away before he could meet her gaze. As she followed the officers, the woman in the yellow hoodie muttered under her breath, "About time." Passengers watched in stunned silence, some raising silent fists in support, others filming every step. Monroe returned to Kevin's row minutes later, alone this time. She knelt so her apology did not tower over him. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice measured, "we sincerely apologize for what you experienced. Flight Attendant Delacroix will not be continuing with this flight." Kevin met her eyes, his throat tight. "Why did it take a phone call to be heard?" he asked quietly, pain and righteous anger woven together in his tone. Monroe hesitated, then admitted, "Sometimes it takes one voice to wake everyone else up." Before more could be said, Captain Andrews interrupted over the intercom. "Thank you for your patience. We are addressing a personnel issue and will resume boarding shortly. You may stretch your legs, but please stay near your assigned seats." No one moved. The cabin felt suspended in time, energized by the weight of a single teenager's quiet defiance. From his window seat in 14A, Kevin saw faces lit by phone screens, each one silently acknowledging the power of bearing witness. A man in a faded baseball cap leaned in and whispered, "You've got guts, kid. I've seen grown men fold in situations like that." Kevin nodded once, holding back a smile. A few moments later, a different flight attendant approached with a seat reassignment slip. "Mr. Johnson," she said softly, "we'd like to move you to seat 2A for the remainder of the flight." He looked at her, surprised. First class was visible through the curtain, empty and gleaming. "I'm fine here," he replied, gesturing to 14A. She shook her head gently. "It's not a reward," she explained. "It's quieter and we thought you might want more space." Kevin hesitated, glancing at the supportive faces behind him. Part of him longed to stay to prove a point, but he also felt the weight of every assumption pressing on him. Finally, he stood and walked forward. Each step felt like a victory lap. As he moved, passengers in his former section offered subtle nods. The woman in the yellow hoodie smiled encouragingly. A young man quietly tapped his chest in a small salute. When Kevin reached seat 2A, he turned and gave a wave that was almost shy, almost grateful. He settled into the plush leather, his backpack at his feet. From this vantage point, he could see the entire cabin. It looked different now. Smaller, friendlier, reshaped by collective empathy. Up in Oakland, Xavier Johnson watched the first viral video climb past 15,000 views in 10 minutes. Dominique, his assistant, glanced at him expectantly. He shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "Let them hurt a little." But as the plane prepared to take off again, he knew the real storm was brewing online. Tweets, videos, passenger testimonials, all colliding to expose a single moment of injustice. By the time Kevin's flight lifted off nearly 2 hours late, the story had become a digital wildfire. While the engines roared to life, Kevin's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. He ignored it, still quiet from the whirlwind of what he had endured. A kind flight attendant brought him a bottle of water. He accepted it with a genuine, if tired, smile. She lingered briefly, perhaps wanting to say more, but a glance at her watch sent her on her way. By the time they landed in Phoenix, Kevin had 50 unread texts. His mother's name flashed 5 times in missed calls. A cousin had already sent him a news alert. Local paper front-paged his ordeal. Passenger's video sparks debate over airline racial bias, the headline read. In the terminal, a Blue Air representative with a tight PR smile approached him. "Mr. Johnson," she began, offering a clipboard with a voucher for future flights, "we'd like to extend our sincerest apologies and offer you this voucher." Kevin looked at the voucher as if it were a trinket. "That is not enough," he said quietly. "Did you watch the video?" The representative hesitated, then nodded. Kevin's eyes locked on hers. "And you still think a voucher fixes this?" he asked, and turned away without waiting for an answer. Back in Oakland, Xavier convened a video call with legal colleagues and journalists. He listened to them parse the situation, calling it a teachable moment. But Xavier felt no desire to console them with platitudes. "This was a quiet kid coming home," he snapped. "You don't get a pat on the back for fixing a mistake you created. Did any of you ever think about that?" One lawyer asked if he planned to file suit. Xavier's gaze hardened. "Not yet," he said, but everyone knew he would. As the story exploded across social media, Kevin Johnson sat in seat 2A, gazing out at the desert landscape below. He thought about his grandmother, about the day he helped her plant daisies in neat rows. He thought about the hurricane of injustice he had faced at 30,000 feet, and how a single call had turned the tide. He was tired, yes, but also fierce with a newfound strength. On the ground in Atlanta, local news vans waited. Reporters called his name as he stepped off the plane, cameras rolling. Kevin paused, glanced at the cameras, then looked past them, seeking his mother's face in the crowd. She rushed forward, enveloping him in a hug that felt like home. He closed his eyes and let her hold him, his small triumph radiating warmth through every fiber of his being. Minutes later, Xavier Johnson emerged from the terminal, eyes sharp. He spotted Kevin and fell into step beside him. "You did great," he said quietly. Kevin nodded, leaning into the compliment. Reporters pressed mics forward, but neither he nor Xavier spoke. They let silence speak for them, a powerful hush that said more than any words could. In the days that followed, Blue Air placed Teresa Delacroix on indefinite suspension pending investigation. A public apology was issued, headlined by Kevin's unlikely heroism. News outlets replayed the video, rewound it, dissected every frame. Opinion columns debated racial bias in travel. Community groups rallied to Kevin's side, organizing fundraisers for civil rights causes. His grandmother beamed with pride and reading, sending him flowers with a note that read, "You have made me proud." When it was all over, Kevin returned home to a quiet morning in Atlanta. He sat on his grandmother's porch, sipping sweet tea and watching robins hop along the railing. He thought about the journey, how his quiet resolve had sent shockwaves through a metal tube, how a single teenager's refusal to shrink had amplified into a chorus of truth. He understood then that true justice was not just about righting wrongs, but about waking the world to its own mistakes. He closed his eyes against the sunshine and whispered to himself, "I belong." And in that moment, the world believed him. Kevin Johnson stepped off the plane in Phoenix and felt a ripple of attention follow his every move. As he walked through the terminal toward his connecting gate, he noticed more than a few double takes. These were not the polite nods people give a fellow traveler. These were looks of sympathy, recognition, curiosity. He felt a tug of self-consciousness, but he kept his posture straight and his stride steady. Near a row of vending machines, a man in his late 40s approached him. "You're Kevin Johnson, right?" the man asked, holding out his hand. "I'm Ronell Burke. I work in education policy. I saw your video." Kevin shook his hand, uncertain what to say. "You didn't yell," Ronell said. "You didn't break down. You held your ground. That is bigger than you know." Then he walked away, leaving Kevin with the echo of those words. On the next flight, Kevin chose a window seat again, but this time there were no confrontations, no harsh whispers, just the gentle hum of the engines and the soft crackle of the captain's announcement. He stared out at the clouds, phone on airplane mode, and allowed himself to exhale. He did not feel like a hero, just tired, and perhaps wiser. But while Kevin tried to slip back into anonymity, the world outside was only growing louder. By the time the plane landed in Atlanta, his name was everywhere. News alerts flashed across his screen, talk show hosts debated his composure, hashtags carried his story from coast to coast. National outlets spun the footage in various ways. Some called it a tragic procedural breakdown, others named it outright as racial bias in real time. His mother, Trina, met him at baggage claim with tears brimming in her eyes. She wrapped him in a hug so fierce he felt like a child again. "You okay?" she finally whispered. "I'm good," he said, voice tight. "Not great, but good enough." On the drive home, they sat in comfortable silence, neither wanting to fill the space with words that could not undo what happened. When they pulled into the driveway, Trina cut the engine but did not move. "Your Uncle Xavier called," she said softly. "He said you handled it better than some lawyers he's worked with." Kevin offered a small smile. "He told me not to say anything," Kevin confessed. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "You gave her a chance," she said. "She chose who she wanted to be." Inside the house, his little sister had taped up a welcome home sign made of construction paper. She did not fully grasp the ordeal he'd endured, but she knew something had changed. Kevin's phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages from old friends, relatives, even teachers he had not spoken to in years. He flipped it face down and let it ring. The following week at school was strange. Hallways that used to swallow him in anonymity now echoed with whispers. Some classmates gave him high fives. Others leaned in to say, "You're that kid on the plane." One teacher pulled him aside and said, "If you ever want to talk, my door is open." Kevin nodded politely but never stepped into that classroom office. He did not want to become a symbol for a movement he did not join by choice. Meanwhile, back in Oakland, Xavier Johnson refused every interview request. He did not want airtime, he wanted accountability. Blue Air finally released a statement calling the incident a miscommunication, promising to review internal protocols and thanking Kevin for his grace. No genuine apology, no acknowledgement of racial bias. Furious, Xavier crafted his own public response in a prominent legal journal. He wrote that what happened to his nephew was not a miscommunication, but a cruel reminder of who gets the benefit of the doubt and who does not. He pointed out that Kevin's calm and polite demeanor should not have been required to secure his seat. The article went viral in under 24 hours. By morning, Blue Air's stock had dipped noticeably. Kevin tried to settle back into routine, but the world wouldn't let him. Handwritten letters arrived at his door. A mother in Pittsburgh prayed that her own son would have the strength he had shown. A retired teacher in Kansas praised his quiet courage. Kevin tucked each letter into a box under his bed, not knowing how to respond but grateful for every word. At school, little acts of kindness reminded him of his impact. A junior classmate tapped him on the shoulder and said, "I was on a flight last weekend. Some passenger made a scene about his seat, and I thought of you the whole time." The school janitor caught him near the vending machines one afternoon and said, "You made me proud, young man. Most folks lose it when the heat is on." Kevin shrugged. "It felt like holding my breath," the janitor smiled. "Doesn't matter. You held it." Writing became Kevin's refuge. He opened a fresh document on his laptop and started journaling. Notes about school, family, the endless buzz of his phone, the strange new role thrust upon him. Sometimes he wrote about that plane ride, other times he didn't. It helped him wrestle the thoughts that kept spinning in his head. Xavier checked in weekly. "Do you want to go public again?" he would ask. Push for policy changes, training sessions, maybe settlements? But Kevin always replied no, at least for now. He did not want to be paraded around for other people's agendas. He wanted to live quietly, on his own terms. Still, the weight of expectation lingered. People wanted him to speak up, to lead, to carry the banner of change. But he was a teenager who wanted to graduate, maybe go to Howard University like his uncle. He was not yet ready to be a movement figure. Yet he could not ignore the quiet shift he had set in motion. One night, Kevin sat in his room and typed a line that felt like both a conclusion and a beginning. Sometimes strength is staying calm when you are righteously angry. He did not post it anywhere. He simply saved the file, as if sealing a personal vow. He understood that his story was not unique. Far from it. It was the story of countless young black boys who had been told to sit at the back of the bus of humanity. But this time, that young boy had refused to budge. That refusal had sparked a conversation, had rattled corporate complacency, had reminded people that power lies not only in the noise you make, but in the quiet clarity you hold. In the weeks that followed, Blue Air's board announced a series of new training programs on implicit bias and passenger rights. Teresa Delacroix was placed on indefinite leave, and a public apology was finally issued. Front and center, with Kevin's name and an admission that the original statement had fallen short. When that apology appeared on the airline's website, named in bold letters, Kevin felt a flicker of satisfaction. It was not revenge in a personal sense, but it was justice, the kind that stings the perpetrator and comforts the witness. He did not celebrate publicly. He did not make a speech. He simply went back to his life, aware that he had changed the course of someone else's day and perhaps, in a small way, the course of an airline's policy. He would never know how many lives were subtly altered by his decision to stand firm in the aisle of Flight 4312, but he knew this: sometimes you have to claim the seat you earned, and in doing so, you claim your own humanity. And that, Kevin thought as he closed his eyes that night, is enough to rattle the walls of indifference.